Hello, my name's Justin the Clue, and I'm by myself today because I just wanted to give a little introduction to this bonus episode that you're listening to right now. This is the Patreon episode we did last week, and I just wanted to give a chance to our regular listeners to listen to what we talk about every week on our exclusive Patreon episodes. Hopefully, you'll enjoy this so much that you're going to rush to your computer to order a subscription that will allow you to listen to the 4 episodes we post every month and the 65 episode back catalog. So, enjoy this bonus episode, and I hope that it inspires you to become a Patreon subscriber. Will, I think I would have liked this movie, but it just didn't have a good story.
You know, I can appreciate lots of kinds of movies, but when I go to a movie, fundamentally what I like is to have a good story to pull me along.
And that is the thing that everybody has always said. And I'm talking about, like, my mom, my dad, my friends, even, like, studio executives, especially, like, directors and actors, when they talk about, like, what attracts you to the thing that you want to do. They're like, well, if it has a good story, I'm right there.
Yeah. Steven Spielberg might say, you know, fundamentally, we directors are storytellers.
Exactly.
And that's what it's all about.
You know, Hook really speaks to me and what it means to be a child and an adult. And it just has a good story, doesn't it?
This is one of my pet peeves.
I think that anybody who's really into movies and reads criticism and gives movies to people and get this response, it bugs them. Mm-hmm. When in reality, like, when people say that, it's just because they can't articulate why they didn't like something.
I think it's especially used as a cudgel to beat avant-garde films with.
Oh, really?
Or to, like, dismiss them, or to not have to deal with them, because people can say something like, yeah, that's Stan Brakhage shit, that's all fine, but really what movies are about are stories.
And we talked a little bit about this in our experimental episode, but what they're really saying is that they don't find it engaging. Like, they don't find something that they can kind of attach themselves to and become involved emotionally without doing too much work.
I think this, you know, it's all about story argument is right, but not in the way that people think it's right. Mm-hmm. Because film, no matter what kind of a film it is an intrinsically narrative art form. Mm-hmm. If you're Norman McLaren and you put, you know, one abstract image next to another abstract image, that's a story. Yeah, well, it's creating an emotional response in the audience. And, like, what do these things together... what do they mean beyond, like, ups and downs and 3-act structures? Yeah, and, you know, somebody like Norman McLaren will, you know, introduce themes and ideas through, like, the shapes and colors. Yes, and if you watch any of his kind of, like, musical-based ones, number one, he has the backing track of the music. So that's a story right there. Exactly, which has its own structure. Mm-hmm. And the way that the shapes play out also tell a story in the sense that there'll be, like, rising action, lowering action. But, you know, many years ago I read a book, a how-to manual on the art of screenwriting. Story by Robert McKee? No, it wasn't as good as that. It was a lesser one. But even this person, and I don't like this book, by the way, but... what was it called? I can't remember what it was called, but even the person who wrote the book said that people don't remember stories, what they remember are scenes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, didn't Howard Hawks say, like, every movie needs, like, 3 or 4 good scenes and no bad ones? Yeah, yeah. And I think that says a lot about, like, what we talk, again, about when we say story. Why does it bug me and you that much? Mm-hmm. Like, is it because these people, when they complain about that, they're complaining about something that we don't think is as important as they think it is? Yeah, and I also think it's like, where are your priorities and how imaginative is your response to a film? Mm-hmm. Like, if you look at, I don't know, a Marx Brothers movie. Yeah. Or a Kung Fu movie, or a Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movie, you might say, well, you know, the dance scenes are great, but where's the story? I think that that's the thing that bugs me the most, is that I feel that, like, some people can't just engage with a movie in parts. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean, like, when we watch most of the Kung Fu films, especially, like, the field fighting ones, where they're just fighting out in a field, and you couldn't even say the story if someone held a gun to your head. You wish people would be like, well, the martial arts scenes, like, those were great, and, like, that's what I like about it, and that's what I want to talk about. Mm-hmm. But that rarely happens. And I mean, I fall into that trap as well, where I'm like, well, overall, it didn't work. And while other times I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt and go like, oh, well, these moments and these things that it did were great. But I think it's a very unimaginative way to engage with film. Basically what it's saying is there's one way for a movie to operate, which is like the traditional 3-act structure. And if a movie doesn't conform to that, if it's more about atmosphere or it's more about an individual performance, capturing a performance, then it's not as valid as a story.
Do you think that these are the barriers that people are bringing to their viewing experiences as opposed to not understanding how to interact with something? If a movie is atmospheric and it works on that level, shouldn't it engage the person automatically, or do they have to come with the critical faculties to be able to enjoy it?
Well, I know that in my own experience, when I was younger, might have... So this is partly the fervor of apostasy, right? Mm-hmm. I might have used that argument of well, sure, the fight scenes are good, but where's the story?
Yeah, I mean, I still sometimes say oh, this was good, but overall, I wasn't drawn in.
But it's an assumption that I think is so drilled into us.
It is
somehow from a very early age,
and it's based upon, like you said, that 3-act structure of what a movie and the story a movie's supposed to tell has to be, which I think is a problem.
Now, one thing I will say is another reason why the argument is semi-right is that movies benefit from having rhythm and pace and a sense of momentum. And, a 3-act structure is kind of like a tried and tested thing. It works on some level.
And when we talk about pace, we also often subconsciously are talking about the fact that there's enough new stuff to keep us engaged that we don't have to sit with something and kind of look at it.
Yeah. Compare a movie like Animal Crackers, which I love, and a movie like Duck Soup, which I love more.
Yes.
Animal Crackers is, a film stage play, and it has 5 or 6 top-notch comedy scenes in it, and, some lesser stuff in between the comedy sequences, and it kind of lives and dies from one scene to the next scene to the next scene, and it feels a little longer than its 90 minutes. But Duck Soup is a movie where I can sense, even though it has no more of a plot, quote unquote, than Animal Crackers, may even have less plot than Animal Crackers, there's more of a sense of momentum to it. It builds more.
Well, I think when people say that they don't like the story, they're also talking about pace and the idea that it's not paced right. The way that even an action film, you can have an amazing action scene, but then it can be too long, so you lose a sense of pace. Or if there's too big a break between action scenes, even though they're the most amazing action scenes ever, then you also lose that idea of connectedness of this film experience. Because the reality is, we're still sitting there from 90 to what feels like 7 hours with some movies, and taking it all in one go most of the time. Or that's how they want us to take it.
And you can definitely have too much of a good thing.
Exactly, yeah. Some people complain about Hard Boiled, there's too much action in that movie. Now, while I disagree, based on my taste, I can understand that.
Sure.
Where I get more frustrated with people are I didn't like that movie because, Hard Boiled, the story wasn't very original. I remember that Tom Weisner in Asian Cult Cinema gives it something 2.5 or 3 stars out of 5, and he does use that complaint of the story is too ludicrous and it wasn't good enough for me to become engaged in it.
I also hate the kind of smug self-satisfaction of that response to a movie, where it might be well, I'm the expert, I know that this is how a movie is supposed to be, rather than willing to kind of open your mind to another experience.
But then at the same time, viewers could also use the complaint of oh, well, it wasn't original enough, and not understanding what they actually mean, because viewers, in reality, even me and you, most of the time when we see something that we like, we don't want them to do something completely opposite of that because we want what we like.
That is true. Genres work that way.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
The viewer understands what it's supposed to be, and if it doesn't hit those tropes, then you have to start using words like post-horror or post-action film or other bullshit like that. But, what are some movies that you wouldn't qualify having good stories, but are considered classics?
I mean, I think most of the movies that I love, some of them have great stories, but most of them, what I'm responding to is not the stories, because I think story is just a vessel. It's a vessel for other things. So last week we talked about The Wizard of Oz. The story is great, but what I really like are the ruby slippers and the makeup on the witch's face.
Yeah, the aesthetics of it.
I mean, I'm not the biggest Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers fan, because I love the dance scenes, but I'm not so crazy about the stuff in between the dance scenes. But I love the dance scenes.
Or Army of Darkness is one of my favorites. What I'm responding to is not the story, which is a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. It's really the energy and the performances and the aesthetics of that. But then I still understand when people, they don't like those things, but then they'll come around and be like, the story wasn't so hot.
Or, Ingmar Bergman's films, his stories are often quite competent.
Yeah.
But I think what people respond more in his films are the cinematography by Sven Nykvist. They like those images of people's faces, those piercing shots of people looking into the camera, and also the ideas that he's communicating.
Yeah, I think the existential musings that Bergman kind of puts out in the world is what people really respond to, because he's also giving the audience an opportunity to kind of mull on it. Because when people talk about Bergman films being slow, it's often because Bergman is presenting these ideas and these images to people, and he wants them to kind of like consider it as it's happening in front of them.
And, we've talked about kind of more durational cinema, like
Chantal Akerman.
Chantal Akerman or Simon Lang or somebody like that, where it's really about existing in that shot for a long time.
And you look at something like Star Wars, like the original one, like George Lucas would never be the one that would jump on his high horse and go, this is new story, this is why it's connecting with people. The reason that Star Wars is connecting with people is because it is those tried and tired tropes like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, but just putting them in a package that everything aesthetically around it just works perfectly. And that's why when you do something like The Last Jedi, who kind of goes against those things, people react so violently to it.
Last week, speaking of the Marx Brothers, I revisited A Day at the Races for the first time in a really long time. I always kind of remembered it as being the beginning of their decline, and it probably is, because the Marx Brothers are a case where the more story they had, in a way, the less funny they got, because they were better as anarchic forces rather than like helping the hero get with the girl, whatever. But A Day at the Races, I really loved it a lot more than I remembered it, because fundamentally it came down to like 5 great comic scenes.
Yes, and so you remember those moments more than anything around it. But do you think that we give more leeway to classical cinema, like I would say probably pre-50s or even pre-40s, than we do to cinema now that feels crazier and it feels much more shambly, because we expect those people making it now to understand the mechanisms that are supposed to go in place. And back then, they were just figuring it out.
Oddly enough, I think, the Hollywood studio era was like when filmmakers were at the height of their competence. I mean, I don't know, look at any mid-level like Hollywood narrative film from the 30s and 40s, and they fucking knew how to make movies. Everyone in the whereas people don't always now. Frankly.
Yeah, 90 minutes.
Now you got a movie. Now you got a director like Tom Hooper who just doesn't know how to make a movie.
Hey, wait, what Tom Hooper films do I like?
The King's Speech.
Oh no, that's not good. Well, I like The Music App. That was fine.
All right, whatever. I hate it, but.
The Tom Hooper hate.
But there are other movies where I find myself returning to them over and over again. Again, not for the story, but because of the atmosphere, because it's almost like a place where I like to visit.
Yeah.
So a week or two ago, I revisited Lucio Fulci's City of the Living Dead.
Oh, love it.
I love it, and it keeps getting better every time I see it. And it's a movie that the plot is incomprehensible.
I remember when I was watching Argento's films that, like, the story not being logical bugged me at that time. And I think that it's probably because I was just entering it from a place that, like, I have these expected things to happen. And when you go against that, I assume it's incompetency.
Yeah, and I think there are certain directors who come along when there's a cinephile is young who kind of unlocks it for them. David Lynch.
Yes.
More than anyone. He's somebody who, I think oftentimes when people are young and watch his movies, they're a little confounded, or they might be frustrated by something like Mulholland Drive, but he also shows them that there are other ways to tell a story and there are other textures.
I'm curious to know when, like, you allow the artist's intent to define the way that you approach a film, because, like, people when they go see a David Lynch film know who David Lynch is. So they're willing to, like, give him these opportunities that what he's doing is intent. Like, The Author's Not Dead was David Lynch, because you know that he's doing these things, whether they're, like, just based on his dreams or whatever, you'll just give it to him. While if somebody else did very similar things, you would assume that person is incompetent or trying to rip David Lynch off.
Well, actually, this is a reason why I find Lucio Fulci so interesting and increasingly interesting, because, like, I think he is a great filmmaker in a way, but he's also, at times, a barely competent filmmaker.
Do you know that he was a huge blowhard in his life that would kind of rag on everybody else's films, saying that his were the best and, like, everybody else was shit in the Italian film industry?
Well, you know what? He's right. But no, but I mean, like, he made movies where the bad stuff and the good stuff are not easily extricable.
Yeah, I understand what you
The
mean.
fact that the acting is bad and the ADR is bad and the plot doesn't always make sense, but sometimes it's hard to tell, does the plot purposely not make sense?
Or was it cut out? Or even something like the use of zooms, which cinema history has basically defined as something that's goofy and something that is kind of anachronistic at this point in time. I was reading a diary that Wim Wenders wrote when he helped Antonioni make a feature film at the time that Antonioni had had a stroke. He could not talk and he couldn't write either, but he was still going to direct a film thanks to the help of his wife and Wim Wenders. And Wenders was saying that like it drove him crazy the way that the camera kept zooming, like Antonioni kept using this technique, and he just didn't like it because it was breaking the reality of the way the human eye can see. Because a zoom in cinema is like one of the textbook things that the eye cannot do. That's not how you look. So to do that kind of breaks the reality of what you're seeing, in the same way that like people use the argument of, well, the story makes no sense because that's not how it would happen, so that's why I don't like this movie. And I think that as we grow older and you see more movies, like those techniques like zooms and stuff, you kind of like start to love them if they're used in a, like a non-goofy way. Kind of like the way that Tarantino uses a zoom is like, look at me, I know I'm using a zoom and it's goofy.
Yeah, or in a kung fu movie when it'll zoom, or a movie like Police Story where you see the same stunt 3 times in a row from 3 different angles.
And like the way Lucio Fulci uses zooms, and he uses so many in his movies, you can tell that it's just like a technique that is in his toolbox. Like he's not using it as like a goofy thing. And I think that goes a little bit beyond of like, oh, it has a bad story, but it plays into it as well. In the same way that when my dad would say something like, well, that movie was weird, what he's saying is that movie was bad and I didn't like it, but he can't quantify why.
Yeah, that's another thing you hear all the time.
So he's trying to say like, well, it doesn't fit within the box of what I expect movies to be, hence I don't like it. Even though that the reality of it may be like he thought it was paced bad or the characters weren't good. So what we're trying to say is that we just want people to, I don't know, use more language when they talk about movies. Or
what are some good screenplays for you? Some movies where you think, you know, the story is actually the real driving.
Well, definitely anything written by Christopher Nolan. Not kidding.
Well, his movies are very plotty, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, Memento is the one that people would use in like school and stuff like that.
Or like Pulp Fiction.
I'm trying to think of like movies that are really plotty that are my favorites, because in reality, the idea of a movie that like falls into a bunch of boxes and kind of like its storytelling is very intricate always interests me a lot. But the ones where I think of that are also kind of linked directly to its visual style, whether it be like Shaun of the Dead or nothing comes to mind.
And, you know, I think one of the reasons why so much online, like TV recap criticism isn't very good is because it really just engages with the stuff on a story level. Like it's like, you know, here's what literally happened in the story this week. Here's my reaction to what happened in the story. Here's what I think may or may not happen next week.
Yeah.
It's not that interesting.
And I think that, like, when you say, like, what are your favorite, like, script, story-driven movies, I was racking my brains of, like, well, what do I own as a script? Because if I think it's good enough, like, I would want to read it on the page and it would have its own value. And I can't think of anything that I have that I own as a script, because why would I read it if I could just go watch the movie instead?
Yeah, I think the only scripts I own are the Monty Python scripts.
Yeah.
You know, in script books.
I had those, too, because it was the only way to experience it at that time.
Yeah, but also because, like, you know, like the Marx Brothers, really they're just a collection of scenes, and their skits are very kind of rhythmical, and it's interesting to see the back and forth as it's written.
I think something like Christopher McQuarrie's script for The Usual Suspects is very interesting, because it's all pretty much there on the page, but like the visual style the movie uses is coming directly from the script. How about you? Is there anyone that you can think of?
I'll put out two. A Fish Called Wanda by John Cleese and Charles Crichton is a movie where a lot of the pleasure comes from watching like the clockwork precision of the story. Like there's not a single wasted beat in the story, and the story is very complicated.
It's funny that like the director has gone on in interviews to say that the movie, like the first cut, like wasn't that funny because he tried to figure out like how you sell these like intricate gags, like the fact that you see a dog get killed at one point and like, should you cut to the dog? Should you not cut to the dog? Is it funny? And that's like beyond the story, right?
Yeah.
But as you said, the story in that movie is still very complicated, and that like that is the building blocks of it, but not the be all end all.
But a story or a screenplay that is often taught in screenwriting classes, Casablanca. It's a movie where a lot of the pleasure comes again from the fact that the story is quite complicated and that there are, you know, 6 or 7 like players on the chessboard and it's watching them maneuver. And, you know, the movie has an amazing sense of pace and the dialogue is great. But I think a lot of the pleasure of the film comes from Humphrey Bogart's
Yeah.
voice, or
Yeah.
the way that he sings, I'm forgetting his name, but as time goes by, or Peter Lorre or Sidney Greenstreet.
It's funny that, like, we've talked about Casablanca, we talked about Wizard of Oz last week, that these movies have come to the point of, like, being a classic when they are not auteurist works. Like, they are individual, like, flash-in-the-pan moments.
Yeah, and also I think maybe comes back to the people who primarily value movies as stories may not primarily value them as like expressions of a filmmaker's ideas or neuroses.
Huh, that's an interesting idea, because I'm trying to think of, like, what do people that I know who don't, like, love movies, just like movies like anybody in the world would, and what are their favorites, and, like, what do they respond to in that regard?
Yeah, because, like, if somebody says, tell me a story, I think kind of what they're saying is, let me forget the world for 2 hours.
Yes,
and
engage me in some way.
Or just kind of, like, entertain me and have it be very passive. Whereas with a more, let's say, auteurist film, or maybe the approach that we might advocate, it's more like a direct communication with the film. Like, it's a different sort of engagement. What I'm trying to say is, like, we're super smart, and these normies don't know how to watch movies.
I mean, I wouldn't get it if I hadn't read Story by Robert McKee. But I think what's the most important out of all of this is the story of Important Cinema Club. It holds up. It's evolving as it's going along.
That's right.
We've changed as people. It's engaging, and that people don't have to think too much when they listen to us.
And people need to listen to this podcast just, like, in one sitting, like, from beginning to end.
We're like Jess Franco. It's like not one movie, it's all the movies.
Yeah,
Same thing
that's
with
right.
Important Cinema Club.